Hello and welcome to the big picture. The Ukrainian crisis, which at the beginning of the month threatened to blow up into the worst ever of the 21st century in Europe, has indeed stood up to expectations. With Crimea, a region of Ukraine, voting in a referendum overwhelmingly in favor of joining the Russian Federation, the situation has turned serious. Within US and European Union, with US and European Union imposing sanctions on some of the Russian and Ukrainian officials and threatening to enlarge it if Russia does not refrain, the crisis seems to be reaching a boiling point. The Russian president, however, seems to be undeterred and even went ahead and declared Crimea as a sovereign and independent country. Is this a show of bravado on the part of Russia, or does it have it in it to ride out of arguably the most serious challenge it has faced since the end of Cold War? We will discuss all this today with Ronen, former Indian ambassador to both Russia and the United States, Professor Ajay Kumar Patnaik of the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies at the JNU, Commodore Uday, Bhaskar, Senior Fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, and Jyoti, Malhotra, Senior Journalist. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Ronen, we were here less than 2 weeks back discussing this, and then I asked you the question that whether this was one of the biggest crises in Europe. Now would you agree that it has blown beyond that?
No, we talked about that time, reference that was there to the Cold War.
Yes.
So, well, I think, and it was not unanticipated, and right now.
Was this Crimean referendum anticipated?
Well, it was coming. In fact, if you really see what happened chronologically also, Kosovo, then you had Georgia, South Ossetia, and now, and we talked about some provocations at that time in Kiev. So I think it's led to that situation. It should have been anticipated.
Did the US and Europe anticipate this?
Probably not, but it could have been anticipated, at least at a particular point of time, at least when we had last discussed this. I think it was anticipated.
Okay, Professor Patnaik, some people call it an aggression on Ukraine by the Russian officials. How do you see this?
See, if you look at the end of the Cold War, generally people say the Cold War ended with this collapse of the Soviet Union. But our view is that the Cold War never ended, and there was a systematic expansion of NATO eastward to Russian borders. Then came the regime change in Georgia and Ukraine. So there has been continuously, now it is quite revealing that there has been systematically a policy of containment of Russia, which continued since the Cold War times. Now it is called neo-containment, and that is when you found some of the states which some geopolitical thinkers used to say in 19th century or 20th century, heartland, dreamland. So they want Russia to shrink in this heartland. Heartland is Eurasia. So to have a series of countries around it, which Spikeman called dreamland, so that this power never grows beyond this area and even shrinks within this area. That is what we have been seeing systematically being done since even this century. And with the rise of Putin, obviously there is challenge to this kind of moves. The same president who has been ousted twice in Ukraine, once in 2004, just after his election, and now 3 years after his election. The same president has been ousted twice. Last time, Russians did not really respond very strongly. They accepted a new president, Yushchenko, who was pro-American, broke up almost all ties with Russia, leading to gas wars in 2006, 2008. And when this new president came and the relations were building up, he was trying to create a balance with Europe and Russia. He was ousted. And this time the Americans did not really anticipate Russia to respond so assertively. And the strength of Russia now is, in 2004, there were a lot of popular protest, and democratic forms of protest. Now it is the fascist and nationalist forces who have used violence and taken over power. And there is a lot of resentment in East and South against this kind of occupation of power by these fascists and nationalists. as a result of which Russia now sees an opportunity that large section of the population of Ukraine doesn't recognize this government as legitimate and would side with
You are
Russia.
saying large sections of the population of Ukraine or large sections of the population of Crimea?
See, this large section have voted, the large section have voted Yanukovych in 2004, they voted Yanukovych in 2010. So this constitutes a very large section and probably the bigger section than the Western Ukrainians. But the Western Ukrainians have the backing of the West, the NGOs funded by the West, the European Union. They all provide that legitimacy to capture power.
So you are saying that this is not an aggression as far as the on part of Russia. It is in fact you are saying that it's some kind of an aggression or provocation from the West.
It is it is a constant provocation that has happened since the end of the Cold War with the NATO expansion. Now seeking Georgia and Ukraine after regime change in 2003 and 4, trying to become NATO members. It has already been moving closer to Russia and creating a fear of encirclement.
Okay.
Now, the Russian option is to create buffers. It has so far not included Abkhazia and South Ossetia into Russian part because it doesn't need to include them into its own territory. It can still keep them as buffers for any NATO expansion to its border.
Let me get Uday Bhaskar. Uday, the Russian president has declared that Crimea is now an independent and sovereign country. Is this acceptable? What will this lead to?
Girish, my own reading is that President Putin has in a way demonstrated what you might call as the de facto control that he now exercises over Crimea. And if you recall our last discussion, I think the sense was that the vote itself was along predictable lines in Crimea, largely because of the demography of the region.
Right.
And at that time we also raised this issue saying that will it lead to any kind of military hostility?
Right.
And my own response or sense at the time was that no, it would not become a military hostility, but there would be some very tense political and diplomatic moments. And I think we are witnessing one of them now, which is that to the extent, and I go along with what Ambassador Ronen Sen and Professor Patnaik have said, that the genesis of this goes back almost to the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and those two very uneasy decades. Could the West have handled it differently? Could the United States have handled it differently? I think in hindsight, the answer is yes. But just now, I think the status of Crimea, independent nation, part of the Russian Federation, or will there be a pause between de facto and de jure, which would give all sides a certain moment? Because in the course of his speech, I was quite struck by the fact that President Putin was making reference to the integrity of Ukraine. Now, what is the interpretation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine when the Crimean region has expressed its preference through the referendum?
Right.
So, my own, I would say, reading at this stage is that President Putin has drawn certain lines, but I personally would say that an independent Crimea is a very low probability in terms of the geopolitics of the region.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that Moscow itself would be an advocate of such a final political contour as far as the Crimean region is concerned.
Okay.
Girish?
In fact, Jyoti, Uday Bhaskar sees that there's a low probability, but after Putin has declared it as a sovereign and independent nation, can he go back on that one? Second thing is, do you think that diplomacy can happen in this kind of an environment between say, US and Russia and Europe?
Well, clearly, Girish, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has won this round. That's very clear. And remember that it's taken Russia 20 years nearly, just over 20 years to win this battle against the West. All your panelists around this table have said that when the Cold War ended at the end of 91, you remember it was the president of Russia, that's Boris Yeltsin, the president of Ukraine, then president of Ukraine and the president of Belarus, that basically came together and decided that the Soviet Union must be dismantled, of course in collaboration with the West. So what do we see now? We see that another Russian president has avenged that lesson of history of international realpolitik. And it's interesting. So look at what Putin is doing. He's vetoing the Security Council resolution on the one hand. On the other hand, he says that it's a sovereign democratic nation. On the third hand, the Crimean parliament has voted to go back to Mother Russia. Now, I think Putin is very comfortable with letting things be ambiguous. He's not making any statements. The people of Crimea have said that they want to go back to the mother country, to be sort of part of Rus or old Rus or new Rus, whichever way you'd like it. So I think he's letting it play out. On the one hand, he's exposing the hypocrisy and the double standards of the West, which moved towards the disintegration of Yugoslavia. In fact, he quotes Kosovo, the so-called independence of Kosovo, and talks about how how Yugoslavia sort of disintegrated in the 90s. And then goes on to say he did not want the disintegration of Ukraine. But what I'm saying is that what really fascinates me here is that the current American ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, who India knows very well because he was a political counselor in the embassy in New Delhi and then went back to the US and is now in Ukraine. He and the very senior American diplomat Victoria Nuland were distributing sandwiches in that Maidan, in the Euromaidan a few weeks ago when the protests were being held before all this sort of snowballed. Jeffrey Pyatt, does he not, or did he not, or did the Americans not understand that you can only push the Russians so far?
So far and no further.
And no further. So
As Patnaik was pointing out earlier, they didn't probably expect this kind of a reaction, and what happened in 2008.
I think they were hoping that Putin would fall in line. But that was a complete misunderstanding of the situation, especially when Crimea is a majority Russian speaking. Not only Crimea, look at the eastern part of Ukraine, which is also a pro-Russian and a pro-Russian majority. Is the American, or what is our understanding now? What is the next step? Is it that the eastern part of Ukraine will also secede from Ukraine and go back to join Mother Russia?
We will see. Mr. Ronen saying these sanctions which have been imposed on certain officials, further sanctions being threatened. You think this is the way forward for this some kind of the situation to come under control?
Well,
do you think Putin is going to get affected by all this?
I mean, of course, people are. I mean, it's going to have an effect in a sense of, I mean, some people have been named, Surkov, Sergei Glaziev, but so far, no major oligarch, that could have had an impact. So it's limited, I would say, but this was expected also. I mean, because he had threatened consequences.
No, but what further sanctions can America or Europe,
well,
European countries impose on it, which can really hurt Russia?
No, I don't think there is anything which will not hurt both sides. Maybe it will hurt Russia more. But right now, I still think that they will remain in contact to try to see how the situation can be contained and work out a framework, because I don't think President Putin's intention is, and I think he said that in his speech also, is to extend this beyond
Uday Bhaskar was mentioning about Putin's speech and his mention of integrity of Ukraine. How do you interpret that statement?
He said that in a sense he gave the background, historical background, which is very essential to understand this. And I have an understanding of it because I was right in Moscow. And I was just not in Moscow, I was India's special envoy to a number of these countries. I went to Georgia to meet the president of Georgia when I was in Moscow. I went to Moldova, where there's also an eastward expansion of Moscow. There I met the president of Moldova. I was just seeing what was happening in the entire Caucasus area. I'd gone to Armenia, that entire area. We saw what happened in Chechnya. Now, if you really look at it, there had to be, and there were several signals on the way. So this was, if Putin should have been expected to have, indicated that this was a red line, and this red line, he would not allow that to be crossed. But having said that, I do not think there will be any action on Kharkiv or Donetsk or any of those areas, I think people will try to have the situation, get it under some semblance of control, and to have a certain, I mean, let's put it this way, I mean, it's clearly the action which was taken right now, it is unconstitutional. But in the same manner,
what
took place,
which one is unconstitutional?
The manner in which the referendum and all took place, of course
No,
it
but,
is.
but
It
what
is
about the removal of the
It is
of the
as
Ukrainian
unconstitutional as that.
itself?
Exactly.
Right.
That was unconstitutional.
Yes.
If you really look back on it, you go back to Kosovo, you look back to a series of things, all those things which were later on ratified by the International Court of Justice, you could call all that into play, but that is not
So
the
a
point.
series of unconstitutional things have been happening there, and nobody can say that we are above blame.
Nobody,
Is that what you're saying?
Nobody can point fingers at each other.
At the other.
Idea is, I think they should now get together, and I think the effort will be there. The door is left open even now.
Professor Patnaik, you think the door is left open, and what kind of
You see, the
diplomacy
door is
you
always,
think will be
the
successful?
door is
in
always
this?
open.
Or do you
because-
think, or the question is, or do you think this is the beginning of a fresh Cold War?
No, I think they have already started the Cold War. They have started, as I said, expansion.
You
But-
said earlier that
but-
the Cold War has never ended.
Yeah, but I see the Russians will still live with it and not go for this kind of an aggressive action and still try the diplomatic way. You see, they lived with Yushchenko, they lived with Saakashvili, who had Western plants in this region. But the point is, see, it is not what the Russians wanted. Crimea had declared even earlier, autonomy resolutions have been passed by Crimea Parliament in the 90s. Independence has been declared by a part of Moldova. Russia never incorporated these areas and never recognized these areas.
But do you think now that they would,
Now,
they
because
would
you see, there are other stakes for
at
Russia.
least as far as Crimea is concerned, now Russia would?
The stakes are very high for Russia because Russia is planning a Eurasian Union in 2015. There is already a customs union, and Ukraine was a huge component of that in Putin's vision of Eurasian Union. Now that is when the West is trying to even break that, and because the president of Ukraine was not willing to join the European Union, and had also was looking at some sort of agreement with Putin. That is when Putin feels that they are trying to break Ukraine away from Russia and the Eurasian Union, that for which Ukraine is so important. So the stakes are very high now because Eurasian Union is going to happen. Already 3 countries are having a common economic space. There will be Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, they will all join that common economic space. But it is Ukraine which was the jewel in that Eurasian Union. And to lose that has been a severe snub to Putin and setback for Putin. That is why, and these are things, as he rightly said, being imposed on Russia. He didn't plan the referendum. He didn't plan the popular protests, in Dnipropetrovsk or Donetsk or Zaporizhzhia or any of these areas. He didn't plan these protests. It's the people who are protesting against an illegal government.
Okay, Uday, Bhaskar. So you think that
Girish,
yes, Uday, my question is, what gives the Russians this kind of a confidence to defy the West and take on all of them? It is quite unprecedented in the last after the Cold War. Would you agree that this is one of the biggest challenges which Russia is facing?
Well, I would say, Girish, the following, that this particular situation is a challenge both to Moscow and to Washington in terms of managing the current tension that has entered the US-Russia bilateral relationship, which has geopolitical linkages, meaning US, European Union and the equivalent of the larger Western alliance. And very interestingly, today President Putin also acknowledged the role played by China, which means, do we infer that there is going to be a certain degree of coordination between Moscow and Beijing? So I would repeat that this is a challenge to both Moscow and to Washington as the principal interlocutors. But I want to add an additional point, if I may, which is that Ambassador Sen spoke about the constitutionality, meaning the lack thereof, both in terms of the ouster of the president as also the way in which the referendum had been called. But I think there's another principle that we also need to keep in mind to triangulate this current situation in Crimea, which is that if you say what is it that should be avoided, I would suggest that it should be any recourse to violence. Whether the violence is state-led, you remember the last time we spoke about this anxiety that
Right.
Moscow is moving military assets into the
Right.
region.
Right.
The United States was responding. So I am suggesting as an analyst that we know what should not be encouraged. Any recourse to violence, whether it is state-led or it is domestic, meaning that whatever be the emotions and the passions about the Crimean decision, the people of Crimea, the Russian-speaking people, or the kind of nationalist sentiment we have seen within Ukraine. Now, if that spills out, I think many of the excesses that we saw soon after the end of the Cold War, whether it was in Yugoslavia or other parts of the Caucasus, I think that would be very, very undesirable.
Okay.
So I think the challenge now, as one sees it as an outsider, is for both Moscow and Washington
avoid-
and Kiev to stabilize the situation and use this as an opportunity for everyone to pause
Okay.
and see how best they could accommodate the interests that have been
Okay.
expressed.
Um,
Girish?
Yeah, Jyoti, that is one, and we are running out of time. So, Indian element in this, because India has virtually backed Russia in its. If you go by the statements of Sri Shankar Menon and others, India seems to have backed the Russian. How does it help? I want Ambassador Sen also to respond to this.
I think it's very apparent. The National Security Advisor, as you said, Shankar Menon, has said that Russia has legitimate interests. And it has legitimate interests. I think what India is saying is, and remember, the statement that was issued both by the Ministry of External Affairs and by Mr. Menon was done when the US Assistant Secretary of State Nisha Biswal was in Delhi. There was a lot of pressure upon New Delhi to support the Americans and to criticize the Russians, but India did not do that. So, but I think the Indian reaction is really stems from the fact that you don't want to upset the balance of power in that region. Ukraine is a contested country, as Professor Patnaik pointed out. It's a jewel of Eurasia. But I think the Americans must understand, which the Europeans, by the way, do understand, that Russia has a sphere of influence.
Right.
The Europeans were beginning to come to terms with it. The Americans still have not. And I think the Indians we have huge interests with Russia even now, even though we are sort of making up with the Americans and have done, as Ambassador Ronen Sen, who's been both ambassador in Moscow and in Washington, D.C., has done for several years. But when you have such primary interests especially defense interests with Russia, there's no way that you can take sides. So,
but we have, Ambassador Sen, we have taken sides.
Well, I think we have been pragmatic, and if you look at it right from the beginning,
Will you agree that we have taken sides?
we have indicated very clearly that we are not going to take a position against Russia in this regard.
Okay.
I don't think we have to say more, but let me tell you very clearly right from the beginning, and this had been the policy of the government of India, which I had recommended also as ambassador in Moscow, that when you had a situation after the breakup of the Soviet Union, you had 15 successor states, but as I've said before, Russia was the state continuator as the only member of the Security Council, as the only nuclear weapon state. And also, therefore, we took several decisions even at that time which were resented by all the other successor states, namely, we negotiated and repaid our debt to the entire Soviet Union to Russia.
Right.
There were other things also which we did. I don't want to get into that, but we should be consistent and we should be pragmatic. We tend to be far too rhetorical. This is, as I said, this is not a matter.
In this case, we are not
pragmatic.
rhetorical. There has been going by what both of you are saying, India has taken a particular stand and made it very clear where we stand on this issue.
I think
there is no ambiguity.
There is no ambiguity. I think India's taken a stand.
Americans can't say that you are being ambiguous.
No, I would agree. Yeah. But having said that, I think you've also explained to the Americans that we have a very good relationship and a very strong relationship with you. But you also have to understand that that other countries, as big and equally powerful, perhaps not as economically powerful, but powerful nevertheless, also have to retain honor and face. You cannot keep rubbing the Russians their nose in the ground and keep saying that, okay, go back, and that you're just an ordinary tin pot dictatorship.
Why are you laughing?
Because Russia's not that.
And why are you laughing?
No, but no, honestly, I think we have been pragmatic, and I think it's and this is a very, very welcome in what we have done. We have to remember in this that there are double standards. We have followed double standards ourselves. We have been the first country in the world to have humanitarian intervention. So in this case, our interests, our national interests dictate that we should take a particular course, and I think
you think we have taken the right course?
Absolutely.
You think we have taken the right course?
Absolutely.
Yes.
My point is, if you look at it from Russian perspective, India's position is a huge favor. No other significant country barring China has come out with such a statement.
Even China abstained. China even abstained in the Security Council.
But
anyway, they must have,
transfer of power in an unconstitutional manner. But the India statement is very strong if you look at it from Russian perspective. And the Americans must be very unhappy with the Indian statement. And I think India cannot justify in any manner unconstitutional grabbing of power and then suppressing a majority population, by force, removing their autonomy. These were autonomous areas when Soviet Union was there. Crimea was an autonomous republic within Ukraine. Now the autonomy was removed in the new constitution.
Now it was supposed to be semi-autonomous.
So they removed the earlier autonomous status of all these areas. Same thing happened to Georgia. They removed the autonomous status of these two.
So India,
regions.
you think that India has taken the right. Uday Bhaskar, would you also agree with that India has taken the right step now, and it would be able to convince Americans about the stand it has taken and not affect the relations with America?
I think, India has definitely indicated its preference. Now, whether this was pragmatic or whether it was more principled, we will only know in the course of the next few weeks or months. But I want to endorse the point made by Ajay Patnaik, which is that we have to proceed with caution, because at the end of the day, major powers, in as much as they are concerned about realpolitik, there also has to be some point of reference to what are the principles which are being contested. Now, the way in which the referendum was held, the post-Soviet geography is still in a state of flux. But at a time when the world is dealing with many other issues, whether it is in West Africa or in the Middle East, the need to evolve some kind of consensus about how states would be dealt with in terms of their domestic turbulence is something that I think both India and China would have to proceed with great caution. So I think both the constitutionality element that Ambassador Sen had referred to and what are the bases on which I think countries like India take their position. Is it more pragmatic? Is it more principled? Is something that is going to, I think, unspool, if I may, in the course of the next few weeks and months. Because I think, as you rightly said, there is no gold standard. I mean, the United States and Bahrain and the United States in the Ukraine are, shall we say, two sharp contrasts in terms of how positions are taken.
Okay.
Girish?
Very quickly, sir. Would you agree with him that, still, whether it's a pragmatic or principled position,
absolutely,
only time will tell?
No, I mean, we have expressed our personal views, but I think obviously time will tell. But so far, our position has been pragmatic, and we have not, resorted to the usual cliches which we tend to do.
Ambassador Sen is being pragmatic, I can tell you, responding to Uday Bhaskar.
Okay. Okay, I think on that note we need to completely run out of time, but this is an interesting debate. Anyway, this is what's happening in Ukraine is not going to end very quickly. We will revisit it at some point of time after once some more developments take place there. Thanks to all my guests, Ronen, Uday Bhaskar, Jyoti, Malhotra and Prof. Patnaik. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue in Big Picture same time tomorrow.